Before we begin, understand the scale of this place. The Gifford Pinchot National Forest in Washington state is 1.3 million acres, and within it lies an area with a name that sounds like a screenwriter's invention, the Dark Divide. About 76,000 acres, the largest roadless area in the western part of the state. There isn't a single road there. Remember that name? It will come up again. On September 14, 2019, a 27-year-old graduate student entered this forest with a laminated checklist in her backpack. 6 minutes after signing the trail register, she vanished for 4 years. Subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications. Every detail here is important.
Saturday, September 14, 2019. Gifford Pinchot National Forest, Washington State. The morning arrived the way autumn mornings arrive in the Pacific Northwest. Not with light exactly, but with a reluctant dilution of darkness. By 6:15 a.m., the tree line along the eastern ridge of the Cispus River Valley had resolved itself out of the pre-dawn gray into something recognizable. Douglas firs, standing like black columns, their canopies holding the last of the night's moisture in long, pendulous beads that would not fall until a wind moved through hours later. The temperature at the Randall Ranger Station weather post read 41 degrees Fahrenheit. The forecast called for clearing by noon and a high of 58. Elara Voss, 27 years old, had checked that forecast 3 times the previous evening. She was the kind of person who checked things 3 times. Her roommate, Josie Peralta, 26, a dental hygienist with a habit of leaving her shoes directly in the path of the front door, would later describe Elara to investigators with a precision that surprised the detective taking her statement. She kept a laminated card on the inside of her hiking pack, Josie said. It had a checklist, every single time. Map, compass, emergency whistle, fire starter, emergency blanket, water filter, first aid kit, headlamp with spare batteries, high-calorie food for 2 extra days beyond the planned trip. She used to say, "The woods don't care about your intentions." By all documentation, Elara Voss was not a reckless person. She was a second-year graduate student in environmental biology at the University of Washington, specializing in mycorrhizal network communication, the underground fungal systems that allow trees to exchange chemical signals and nutrients. Her thesis advisor, Dr. Renata Cho, 49, described her academic work as unusually rigorous, a compliment that carried the particular weight of understatement characteristic of academic culture. Her fieldwork in Gifford Pinchot was an extension of her thesis research. She had visited the same 11-kilometer section of the forest interior 7 times in the preceding 14 months, always logging her entry and exit times at the Iron Creek Campground trailhead, always texting her field notes to Josie each evening. The campground host, a retired postal worker named Ed Griggs, 63, with a sun-damaged neck and a fondness for cheap cigars, knew her by first name. "She brought me a jar of blackberry jam," he would tell the search coordinator 2 weeks later, "from her grandmother's garden. Who does that?" On the evening of Friday, September 13th, Elara had arrived at Iron Creek Campground at approximately 7:30 p.m., securing campsite number 8, the one she always preferred because it sat farthest from the generator enclosure and closest to the tree line. She set up her 2-person MSR Hubba Hubba tent alone, ate a dinner of trail mix and a protein bar heated over her compact Jetboil stove, and called her mother, Diane Voss, at 8:47 p.m. The call lasted 22 minutes. Diane would later replay the recording of that call. She had the habit of recording family calls on her phone, an eccentricity she had never thought to mention to her daughter, until the words wore grooves in her mind that she could not fill with anything else. She sounded good, Diane told the King County Victim Services counselor assigned to the family weeks after the disappearance. She was excited about something she'd found. She kept saying she needed to document it in the morning, that the light would be better. Something about a particular grove, maybe 2 kilometers in from the main trail. She said she'd call me Sunday night when she got back to Seattle. Diane's voice, in the transcript of that session, pauses for 6 seconds before she continues. She always called Sunday night, always. When I didn't hear from her, I thought my phone had died. I checked it 4 times. Elara rose at 5:55 a.m. on Saturday, September 14th. The Randall Ranger Station's weather post registered 39 degrees at that hour. She ate a breakfast of instant oatmeal and black coffee, broke down her campsite with the systematic efficiency her checklisted mind demanded, and locked the majority of her gear inside her 2014 Subaru Outback, dark green, Washington plates reading BHT4892, before loading only her day pack. Ed Griggs saw her at 6:40 a.m. from the window of the host trailer, watching her cross the gravel loop road toward the trailhead. She was wearing a burnt orange fleece jacket, charcoal gray hiking pants, waterproof Salomon trail shoes in teal and black, and a forest green baseball cap bearing the University of Washington logo. He did not call out. He would spend a long time afterward thinking about whether he should have. She signed the Iron Creek Trailhead Register at 6:48 a.m. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate, slightly left-leaning. She wrote her name, the date, the time, her vehicle's license plate, and her planned return time, 3:30 p.m. Below the return time, she had written a brief notation, as was apparently her custom: Cispus River Junction, East Fork, 2.1 kilometers interior, fungal grid survey. That register entry would become one of the most examined documents in the subsequent investigation, photographed, forensically analyzed, and eventually displayed on the wall of the Skamania County Sheriff's Office incident room, where investigators would stare at it for months, trying to understand what could have happened in those 8.7 hours between Elara's neat, calm signature and the moment Ed Griggs walked to her car at 5:15 p.m. and found it exactly where she had parked it, still locked, a smear of dried mud on the passenger side rear wheel arch that had not been there the previous evening. By the time her trail shoes had carried her past the first bend in the Iron Creek Trail, past the point where the gravel transitions to packed earth and the Douglas firs close overhead and the campground behind you becomes invisible, replaced entirely by forest and root and morning shadow, the world outside the trees had already begun its Saturday routine. 800 miles away in Spokane, her father, Gerald Voss, was drinking his first cup of coffee and reading the sports section. In Seattle, Josie Peralta was still asleep, her phone on the nightstand, the screen quiet. In the Randall Ranger Station, the duty officer, a seasonal ranger named Kyle Okafor, 25, broad-shouldered and newly certified in wilderness first aid, was logging the previous night's weather data. No one was watching the trail. At 6:54 a.m., the forest swallowed Elara Voss. No photograph, no security camera, no passing hiker recorded her from that moment forward. The next image of her that would surface, the next evidence that she had continued to exist in the world as a living, breathing, three-dimensional person after stepping past the range of human witness, would not emerge for 4 years, 2 months, and 17 days. Sunday, September 15th, 2019. Thursday, October 3rd, 2019. The first call came in at 6:22 p.m. on Sunday, September 15th. It was Diane Voss, ringing the Skamania County Sheriff's Office from her home in Bellevue. Her voice on the recorded call was controlled, the particular control of a person actively suppressing panic. My daughter was supposed to call me last night and she didn't. She's a hiker. She was in Gifford Pinchot. She always calls. The dispatcher, a woman named Sandra Felt, 41, who had worked the Skamania County switchboard for 9 years, asked the standard intake questions: vehicle information, physical description, last known location, time of planned return, which had already passed by more than 26 hours. Sandra Felt escalated the call within 4 minutes. This would later be noted in the review of the investigation's early hours as an important procedural decision, because the standard protocol at the time allowed dispatchers a broader window before escalation in cases involving adult hikers who were overdue by less than 48 hours. Sandra Felt, by her own account, had a feeling. She was a grandmother of 3. She knew what a mother's voice sounded like when it was not quite steady. By 7:45 p.m. Sunday, Skamania County Sheriff's Deputy Thomas Wren, 38, a compact, methodical man with a reputation among his colleagues for meticulous incident documentation, had driven to Iron Creek Campground. He found the Subaru Outback exactly where Ed Griggs had noted it. Campsite 8 loop, unoccupied, locked, mud on the rear wheel arch. He confirmed with Ed Griggs the timeline of Elara's departure and noted the trailhead register entry. He photographed everything. He waited at the campground until 10:30 p.m., walking the first 400 meters of the Iron Creek Trail with his flashlight, calling Elara's name into the darkness. The forest returned his voice to him each time, slightly hollowed. The formal search and rescue operation was activated at 7 a.m. on Monday, September 16th. Skamania County Search and Rescue, in coordination with the Gifford Pinchot National Forest Service and Washington State's Emergency Management Division, deployed an initial team of 22 ground searchers, 2 canine units, and a single Bell 407 helicopter from the Kelso/Longview Airport, leased under emergency contract. The incident commander was a veteran SAR coordinator named Dale Fitch, 55, a former Forest Service ranger with a close-cropped gray beard, and a habit of speaking in declarative half-sentences that left the listener feeling vaguely briefed rather than fully informed. He set up the command post in the Iron Creek campground parking area, where a folding table, 2 portable radios, and a laminated topographic map of the search grid served as the operational nerve center for what would become the largest search operation in Skamania County in 11 years. The terrain was the first enemy. The Gifford Pinchot National Forest encompasses nearly 1.3 million acres of Pacific Northwest wilderness. The section in question, the eastern drainage of the Cispus River, extending northeast from the Iron Creek trailhead, was characterized by ground search teams as variable and unforgiving. The trail itself was well maintained for the first 1.8 kilometers, then fragmented into a network of use trails, elk paths, and faint topographic features that could easily be mistaken for maintained paths by someone moving quickly or in deteriorating light. The forest floor was a dense compression of sword ferns, Oregon grape, and fallen nurse logs, some of them concealed beneath decades of accumulated moss, capable of hiding a human body. Capable of hiding, as Dale Fitch put it in his first press briefing, just about anything you didn't want to find too quickly. The canine units, Belgian Malinois named Pilot, handled by volunteer tracker Sandra Now, 44, and a bloodhound named Clement, handled by County Deputy Lisa Bowen, 31, picked up scent from Elara's tent fabric and sleeping bag, which Diane had driven to the command post overnight, arriving at 5:15 a.m. Monday, still in the clothes she had slept in, which was to say the clothes she had been wearing when she received Deputy Wren's first call, because she had not slept. Both dogs tracked Elara's scent along the Iron Creek Trail to the 1.9-kilometer mark with high confidence. Handlers rated confidence at 85%. Then both lost the track simultaneously at a point where the trail crossed a seasonal drainage channel approximately 12 meters wide. The rocks in the channel were slick with algae. There was no footprint in the soft earth on the opposite bank, no fiber on the low branches, no disturbance in the fern line. The dogs milled. Sandra Now walked Pilot in expanding arcs on both sides of the channel for 40 minutes. Clement sat down and looked at the opposite bank with the mournful authority of a creature who has exhausted the evidence of his own senses. The helicopter completed 4 low-altitude passes over the interior grid on Monday and found nothing. The color of Elara's fleece, burnt orange, should have been visible against the gray-green canopy had she been lying anywhere in an exposed position. The crew saw nothing but tree cover and the occasional silver thread of moving water. By Wednesday, September 18th, the ground team had expanded to 61 searchers, supplemented by a volunteer group organized through a Facebook post that Josie Peralta had made Sunday evening, which had been shared 4,400 times by Monday morning. The volunteers were briefed by Dale Fitch on search protocol, divided into teams of 4, and assigned grid sectors on laminated map segments. Among the volunteers was a man named Martin Colby, 43, a freelance landscaper from the town of Morton, 17 miles west of the search area, who would later become a figure of significant investigative interest. At the time, he was indistinguishable from the other volunteers, a man in work boots and a waterproof jacket carrying his assigned radio, checking in at grid markers with the others. He had a broad, open face, the kind of face people trusted. He had mud on his boots from his own yard, not from the trail. Dale Fitch would not know this for 3 more years. The single clue surfaced on Thursday, September 19th at 2:41 p.m. A ground searcher named Paul Yee, 29, a structural engineering graduate student volunteering on his day off, was moving through a dense section of old-growth fir approximately 2.3 kilometers from the trailhead, east of the drainage channel. He was methodical, stopping every 10 meters to scan the ground in a full 360-degree turn, the way he had been instructed at the volunteer briefing. It was on one of these turns that he saw it, a mark cut into the bark of a Douglas fir approximately 1.4 meters from the ground. Not a trail blaze, not a Forest Service marker, not a carved initial, or a casual vandal's gesture. Paul Yee was not a hiker by background. He had grown up in Tacoma. He had never spent significant time in old-growth forest, had no particular familiarity with arborist work or tree maintenance, had no frame of reference for the specific lexicon of marks that foresters, surveyors, hunters, and trail crews leave on trees in the course of their work. What he registered, in the pure, unconditioned language of instinct, was that the mark looked deliberate. It looked purposeful. It looked like it meant something. The mark was a rectangle, roughly 8 centimeters tall by 5 centimeters wide, carved cleanly through the bark to the pale cambium layer beneath. Inside the rectangle, 3 parallel diagonal lines, cut with the same precision. The tool used was something with a fine edge, not a hatchet or a broad hunting knife, but something narrower, something controlled. The cuts showed no weathering. They had been made recently. Within the last week, Skamania County forensic botanist Dr. Iris Nakamura, 38, would later estimate, based on the oxidation pattern of the exposed wood and the absence of secondary insect activity in the wound margins, possibly within the last 48 hours. Paul Yee photographed the mark with his phone and called it in on his radio at 2:43 p.m. It was, at that moment, the only piece of evidence in the Elara Voss disappearance that was not simply an absence. Everything else in the case, her locked car, the faded scent trail, the silent radio, was the negative space where a person had been. This mark was something. It was positive. It was placed. Dale Fitch examined the tree at 3:30 p.m. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, in his characteristic declarative half-sentence, "Doesn't match any system I know." The search continued for 11 more days. By October 1st, the volunteer numbers had dwindled to fewer than 20 on any given day. The helicopter had completed a total of 17 sorties and logged 0 confirmed sightings. The K9 units had been deployed 5 additional times without result. The weather had shifted. A low-pressure system moved in from the Pacific on September 23rd, bringing 4 consecutive days of rain that saturated the forest floor, degraded any remaining ground sign, and turned the drainage channel where the dogs had lost the track into a turbulent, knee-deep flow. On Thursday, October 3rd, 2019, at a press conference held in the Randall Ranger Station parking lot under a pewter-colored sky, Dale Fitch announced the suspension of active search operations. He read from a prepared statement. He used the phrase, "exhausted all available resources." He used the phrase, "no confirmed evidence of foul play." He used the phrase, "case remains open and under active investigation," which was technically true in the sense that the file would remain accessible on a detective's desk, and technically misleading in the sense that no additional resources had been allocated for its continuation. Diane Voss stood at the back of the small crowd of reporters and local residents who had assembled for the announcement. She wore a beige raincoat and held a small laminated photograph of Elara, the one from her university ID, inside her jacket, against her chest, thumb pressing the edge, a gesture so private and habitual that she had stopped being aware she was doing it. She did not speak to the press that day. She drove home to Bellevue alone. She called Gerald in Spokane from a rest stop on Highway 12, and they talked for a long time about nothing in particular, which is the way people talk when the only real thing there is to say is the one thing they cannot yet say. The photograph of the tree mark, that rectangle with its 3 interior diagonal lines, entered the case file as Exhibit 7-C. It was not, at the time, connected to any known symbology, any criminal database, any prior incident in Gifford Pinchot, or any adjacent forest management area. It was, in the terminology of the Skamania County Investigative Unit, an anomalous marking of unknown origin and purpose. No one who read that notation in the fall of 2019 could have known that the same marking, that same precise rectangle, those same 3 diagonal lines, had appeared on trees in 6 other Pacific Northwest wilderness areas over the preceding 9 years, and that every location where it had appeared corresponded to a place where a person had disappeared.
Let's stop here. At this exact phrase, the story changes its nature. Up until this second, we were looking at the tragedy of one person. An accident, the wilderness, an unfortunate turn of events. That is how it was recorded in the documents. There are no confirmed signs of a crime, but now it is no longer about just one person. 6 locations, 200 miles of wilderness, 9 years, and every time the same geometry. A rectangle and 3 diagonal lines carved down to the cambium with the same tool. No one saw it, not because the evidence was hidden. On the contrary, it was carved into a tree 5 feet off the ground. It's just that there was no one to put it all together into one picture. The data existed, but there was no connection between it. And for the next 3 years, one detective would piece this connection together alone.
October 2019 to March 2023, time moves differently when someone you love is simply gone, not dead, or at least not confirmed dead, not found, or at least not yet. Gone in the pure grammatical sense, the word stripped of all its softer meanings. Diane Voss would describe the experience later in a victim impact statement that a prosecutor would characterize off the record as one of the most precisely articulated descriptions of ambiguous loss she had encountered in 15 years of criminal law, as living inside a question mark. She said, "Every morning you wake up, and the first thought is, maybe today. Every night you fall asleep, and the last thought is, maybe tomorrow. And the worst part is that you can't even grieve properly, because grief requires an ending, and there is no ending. There is only the ongoing present tense of not knowing." The case file for Elara Voss's disappearance was assigned to Detective Carol Meyerson, 44, of the Skamania County Sheriff's Office. Meyerson was a 10-year veteran of the Detective Division, a woman with close-cropped brown hair going silver at the temples, and a desk that was a studied chaos: papers, sticky notes, manila folders, 3 coffee mugs in various states of use, from which she claimed to be able to retrieve any document within 45 seconds. Her colleagues did not doubt this. She had a particular reputation for the kind of case that didn't resolve, the ones that sat in the file drawer, not because no one was working them, but because there was nothing to work. She kept the Voss file in the top drawer. It was the only case file she kept in the top drawer. In the first year after the suspension of active search, Meyerson submitted 4 separate requests to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, cross-referencing Elara's physical description, dental records, and DNA profile, obtained from a hair sample collected from the Subaru's headrest, against every reported discovery of unidentified remains in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Each query returned no match. Elara Voss was not among the dead who had been found. She was not, as far as the system knew, among the dead at all. Meyerson also spent 3 evenings in November 2019 at her kitchen table with printed satellite images of the search area, tracing and retracing the logical paths a person could have taken from the point where the dogs lost the scent. She had a yellow legal pad covered in handwritten questions, 2 of them circled repeatedly with blue ballpoint ink until the paper was nearly torn. Read, "Where does the mark system come from?" And who else was in that forest that weekend? The second question had been difficult to answer, partly because the trailhead register was voluntary, not every hiker signed it, and partly because the Iron Creek Campground's records for the weekend of September 13th to 15th were incomplete. Ed Griggs, the camp host, maintained a physical ledger of registered sites, but the campground's eastern loop, sites 12 through 18, had been serviced by a temporary host that weekend, a seasonal worker named Brett Alden, 22, who had subsequently left his position to travel abroad, and whose whereabouts in the months following the disappearance were periodically of interest to investigators, though no evidence ever emerged to establish him as anything more than a negligent record keeper. The question about the tree mark proved, in the end, to be the more consequential one. In January 2020, Meyerson contacted the Forest Service office in Vancouver, Washington, and requested a review of any similar markings reported in Gifford Pinchot in the preceding decade. The Forest Service's trail maintenance coordinator, a bearded, encyclopedic man named Oliver Strauss, 51, who had spent 24 years documenting trail conditions across the National Forest, told her he had never personally encountered the marking described in the case file, but he knew someone who might have. That someone was Ranger First Class Vivian Dahl, 39, stationed at the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument Ranger Station, 17 miles from the Iron Creek Trailhead. Vivian Dahl was what her colleagues called an extraordinarily attentive observer of the landscape. She had a habit of photographing anything in the forest she couldn't immediately explain: a fresh-cut stump where no logging permit had been issued, a pile of flagging tape in an unexpected location, boot prints in unmarked areas, and on 2 occasions in the preceding 4 years, a particular carved marking on a tree. She had photographed both instances and added them to her personal documentation file, which she kept on a laptop at the ranger station under a folder titled, "With Characteristic Practicality, Things That Don't Belong." When Meyerson drove to the Mount St. Helens station on February 4th, 2020, a gray Tuesday with ice on the approach road, and Vivian Dahl opened her laptop and turned the screen toward her, Meyerson looked at the 2 photographs for a long time without speaking. Both photographs showed the same marking, a rectangle, approximately 8 centimeters by 5, carved to the cambium layer. 3 interior diagonal lines, parallel, precise. The first photograph had been taken on October 11th, 2016, 4.7 miles into the Dark Divide Wilderness area. The second had been taken on August 3rd, 2018, 3.1 miles along the Boundary Trail northeast of Ryan Lake. Meyerson asked Vivian when she had first decided to document this particular type of mark. Vivian pulled out a physical notebook, a green Write in the Rainfield notebook, its cover water-stained, its pages dense with handwritten entries. She found the first entry, September 9th, 2014, a marking observed 2.2 miles east of the Quartz Creek trailhead. She had sketched it in pencil. The sketch was exact. "I always assumed it was a survey mark," Vivian said, "something technical, but it didn't match any Forest Service protocol, and it didn't match USGS notation. I looked it up." She paused. "When I couldn't find what it meant, I just kept photographing them. In case. 2 words that, between a detective and a ranger standing in a cold office in February 2020, contained an enormous amount of shared, unspoken professional unease. Meyerson returned to her office and spent the next 2 weeks tracing the geographic coordinates of every documented instance of the mark. Vivian's 2 photographs, Paul Yee's photograph from the Elara Voss search, and 3 additional instances she found, upon deeper research, in trail condition reports filed by volunteer trail crews with the Pacific Crest Trail Association between 2013 and 2017. 6 instances covering a geographic range of nearly 200 miles of Pacific Northwest wilderness, spanning a 9-year period. She mapped them on a printed topo atlas spread across the surface of her conference room table using red pushpins for the mark locations and yellow pushpins for documented disappearances in the same geographic areas. She found 4 correlations, 4 instances where a disappearance had occurred within 3 miles and 18 months of a marked tree. Elara Voss was one of the 4. She wrote a summary memo and sent it to her supervisor, Sheriff's Captain Raymond Holt, 57, a cautious institutional man who had spent 30 years calibrating his responses to exactly the point where they could not be criticized, either for excessive action or insufficient action. He read the memo twice and told her to continue developing the theory, which meant, in institutional language, interesting, not yet actionable, do not allocate significant resources. Meyerson continued alone. In 2021 and 2022, the Voss family maintained their own search in the only way available to them: a website, a tip line, a $50,000 reward, funded by a combination of family savings and a crowdfunding campaign that had raised $31,400. Gerald Voss drove to the Gifford Pinchot Forest 4 times in 2020 and twice in 2021, walking the Iron Creek Trail to the drainage channel where the dogs had lost the scent, standing in that spot in different weather and different light, performing the arithmetic of disaster that fathers perform when the only alternative to calculation is despair. The tip line received 212 calls over 3 years. Meyerson reviewed each one. 194 were irrelevant. 11 were possible leads that, upon follow-up, dissolved into coincidence or misidentification. 7 were from people with no information but a need to express something. Grief, horror, a kind of civic guilt to someone who would listen. Meyerson listened to all of them. One call, received on November 17, 2021, was from a woman who would not give her name. The call lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The woman's voice was low, and in the recording there is a sound in the background that acoustic analysts later identified as a domestic fan, the kind mounted in a bathroom or utility space, running continuously. The woman said she had something she needed to say but was afraid. She said she had seen something in the woods near the place they were looking. She said she had seen marks on trees, like a language. She said the person who made the marks knew how to be invisible. She said she was afraid because the person who made the marks knew where she lived. Then the call ended. The number was a prepaid cell phone. It pinged a tower in the Morton, Washington area. Martin Colby lived in Morton. Carol Meyerson put a third pushpin on her map, yellow, for the tip. She placed it on Morton. She did not yet know what it meant. She was beginning to understand the shape of it. The years moved forward the way years move, when a case is classified as cold, and a person is classified as absent, and a family is classified as receiving support services. Elara Voss's university department quietly retired her doctoral thesis project. Her supervisor, Dr. Renata Cho, published a paper in 2021 on mycorrhizal network communication in old-growth Pacific Northwest forest, and included in the acknowledgement section a single line. This work was begun in conversation with E.V., who is not forgotten. Josie Peralta moved to Portland, married a man named Tom, had a child. She kept the laminated hiking checklist. She had found it in Elara's desk drawer when she packed up her things, and had not known what to do with it, and so had kept it in a plastic sleeve in her own bedside drawer, where it remained. In the drawer of Carol Meyerson's desk, Exhibit 7C sat in its plastic evidence sleeve, a photograph of a mark on a tree, a rectangle with 3 diagonal lines, waiting with the cold patience of evidence for someone to finally understand what it said. Thursday, December 1st, 2022, Morton, Washington, 11:22 a.m. The Morton Public Library occupied a modest tan brick building on Main Street, sandwiched between a pharmacy and a real estate office. Its parking lot separated from the adjacent residential street by a chain-link fence along whose top edge, in September, morning glories occasionally appeared, volunteering from some unknown garden source, blooming blue and then dying when the frost arrived. The head librarian was a woman named Frances Alt, 58, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and had the quality, common to long-serving small-town librarians, of knowing nearly everything about nearly everyone in the community without having appeared to be paying particular attention. At 11:22 a.m. on Thursday, December 1st, 2022, a woman walked through the library's front door and stood in the entrance area for a moment before proceeding. Frances Alt was at the front desk sorting an incoming box of interlibrary loans. She looked up. She later told Detective Meyerson that her first impression was of someone who had been walking for a very long time. Not tired exactly, more like she'd forgotten that stopping was something people did. She stood in the doorway and looked around, and she looked confused that there was a ceiling. The woman was wearing clothing that was significantly too large for her. A man's flannel shirt, gray work pants cut off, and hemmed at the knee with what appeared to be duct tape, and rubber-soled slip-on shoes that were split along the outside seam of the left shoe. She was thin in a manner that was visible, even through the oversized shirt, the kind of thinness that indicates a prolonged and systematic insufficiency rather than a dietary choice. Her hair was dark brown, unwashed, cut bluntly and unevenly at approximately jaw length. She had a cut on the back of her right hand, partially healed, and a bruise along her left jawline in the yellow-green stage of resolution, meaning it was approximately 10 to 14 days old. Frances Alt said, "Can I help you?" The woman walked to the desk slowly, the way a person walks who has learned to move carefully in order not to draw attention to themselves. She stood at the desk for a moment without speaking. Then she said, in a voice that was quiet and slightly hoarse, as though the muscles required for normal conversational volume had been underused for a very long time, "I need to use the phone." Frances Alt pushed the desk phone toward her. The woman picked up the receiver and held it for a moment, and Frances Alt noticed that she was looking at the keypad the way a person looks at something they have not seen for a very long time, but whose function they theoretically remember. She dialed 911. Her hands were steady. The 911 call was received at the Lewis County Sheriff's Dispatch at 11:24 a.m. The call taker was dispatcher Marcus Webb, 30, who had taken roughly 14,000 calls in his 4 years on the job, and would later say that this was the call he had never expected to receive. The woman on the line said, "My name is Elara Voss. I've been held against my will. I need help." Then she gave the library's address, reading it from a plaque on the desk, and stood holding the receiver against her chest until the deputies arrived. The first unit, Lewis County Sheriff's Deputy Amelia Cruz, 34, arrived at 11:31 a.m. She found Elara Voss seated in a chair that Frances Alt had quietly moved out from behind the information desk and placed in front of a small space heater the library kept for staff. Frances had also produced, from somewhere in the library's back room, a wool blanket and a cup of hot tea. When Deputy Cruz entered, Elara Voss was holding the tea in both hands and looking at it as though it was the most important object she had ever seen. She was not crying. She would not cry for several days, as though the mechanism had been disconnected at some point and required time to reconnect. Amelia Cruz knelt on one knee in front of the chair so she would be at eye level and said, "I'm Deputy Cruz. You're safe. We're going to take care of you." The report she filed that afternoon noted that at this statement, Elara Voss looked at her for a long moment and then looked back at the tea, as though she was waiting for the statement to prove itself true before she committed to believing it. At 11:48 a.m., Elara Voss was transported to Morton Community Medical Center. The attending physician, Dr. Amir Saleh, 41, a compact, quietly professional man who had spent 6 years working in emergency medicine before taking the position in Morton, documented the following in her initial medical assessment: patient female, estimated late 20s, presented via law enforcement with self-identified name of Elara Voss. Presenting conditions: severe malnutrition, estimated 28 to 32 pounds, below normal body weight for height and frame, multiple healed and partially healed contusions to arms, torso, and lower extremities consistent with repeated blunt force impact, evidence of chronic vitamin D deficiency, consistent with prolonged inadequate sun exposure, healed fracture of the left fourth metacarpal, approximately 12 to 18 months prior, without evidence of medical treatment, bilateral wrist abrasions, consistent with repeated restraint. Patient is alert and oriented, displays flat effect and significant startle reflex to sudden sounds or movement. Speech is measured and somewhat pressured. Patient has confirmed she has been held against her will. Investigation warranted. At 12:55 p.m., Carol Meyerson received a call on her cell phone from the Skamania County Sheriff's Dispatch with a jurisdictional heads-up from Lewis County. She was in her car outside a gas station on Highway 14 when the call came in. The call lasted 40 seconds. After it ended, she sat in the parking lot for 3 minutes without starting the car, and then drove north toward Morton at a speed that her own dash cam later recorded as somewhat in excess of the posted limit. She arrived at Morton Community Medical Center at 2:05 p.m. and identified herself to the floor nurse, a man named Daniel Keat, 29, who led her to a room at the end of the hall. He paused before opening the door and said, in a low voice, "She's talking. She wants to talk, but she keeps checking the door." Carol Meyerson asked what he meant. Daniel Keat said, "Every time someone comes in or walks past, he demonstrated with his own shoulders, drawing them up, ducking his chin. Like she's expecting something to come through it, like she's still waiting for something." Carol Meyerson sat in the chair beside Elara Voss's hospital bed for 4.5 hours that afternoon. She had a recorder. She had a yellow legal pad, the same kind she used at her kitchen table, its pages still carrying the faint impression of the circles she had drawn around questions years before. She listened more than she spoke. Elara Voss spoke in a low, measured voice, pausing frequently, occasionally losing the thread of a sentence, and then finding it again from a slightly different angle, the way a person speaks whose continuous inner narrative has been subjected to long interruption and must now be laboriously reconstructed. She had been held, she said, in a cellar. Not here in Morton, somewhere in the woods. She could not tell Meyerson where exactly, because she had never known where exactly. She had been transported to and from it, in a vehicle with blacked-out windows, disoriented, unable to track direction or distance. She knew there were trees. She always knew there were trees. She could hear them when the wind moved, a sound that came through the concrete walls and the metal door as a distant rushing, like water heard from underwater. She had been there for most of 3 years. She was not sure of the exact time. He had removed her watch on the first day. There were no windows in the cellar. He controlled the light with a bare bulb on a timer. The timer had been irregular, she believed deliberately so, to prevent her from establishing a reliable sense of time. She had kept her own calendar by marking, with a small piece of gravel she had worked loose from the floor, a series of scratches on the back wall of the cellar, behind the pipe along the north face. She had not been entirely certain how long she had been there, but she had 1,008 scratch marks. Meyerson looked up from her yellow legal pad. 3 years, Elara said, give or take. Her voice was flat, factual, a scientist reporting a result. Friday, December 2nd, 2022. Tuesday, December 6th, 2022. The interview process took 3 days. Elara was interviewed by Detective Meyerson, by a forensic psychologist named Dr. Petra Lund from the University of Washington's Trauma Assessment Unit, and by a Lewis County investigator named Brad Toes, 46, who had been assigned to the case on the Lewis County side due to the county overlap in potential jurisdiction. The 3 interviewers met each evening to compare notes and construct a working geography of what Elara had described. The physical dimensions of the cellar, approximately 5 meters by 4 meters she estimated based on her own stride count. The material of the walls, poured concrete, rough-surfaced. The door, steel, single lock, hinged to open inward. The dimensions of the room above the cellar, as she had occasionally been permitted to glimpse it on the rare occasions the door was opened from outside. She described the man. She had never known his name. He had never told her his name. She had thought of him, over time, by a name she had given him privately, which she declined to share with the investigators. It was, she said, something that belonged only to her, and she wished to keep it. What she could describe was his appearance, approximately 5 feet 10, medium build, brown hair going gray at the sides, wide open face, large hands. Probably in his early to mid-40s. He wore work clothes, canvas pants, flannel shirts. He smelled of soil and wood smoke. He drove a pickup truck, dark color. She had heard the door of it, the particular heavy sound of an older model truck's door. He had brought her food on an irregular schedule, and the food had been plain and sometimes insufficient, and occasionally, when he was in what she described as a calm period, adequate. He had spoken to her infrequently. When he did speak, he was not loud and not cruel in his voice, which was almost worse than cruelty would have been, because it meant that what was happening was not passion or rage, but something colder and more settled, a decision. He thought it was normal, Elara said to Dr. Lund on the second day. That's the thing. He was very calm about it. The way people are calm about things they've decided are just the way things are. The description matched Martin Colby in every particular. Carol Meyerson already knew Martin Colby. She had traced him through the volunteer search log, through the prepaid phone tower ping near Morton, through 2 additional pieces of information she had developed in 2022 after a renewed effort prompted by her 4th annual review of the case file. A report from a Lewis County land assessor showing that Colby had purchased 4.8 acres of forested land northeast of Morton in 2008, and a note in a 2017 county building inspection file indicating that a permit had been requested and subsequently withdrawn for the construction of a root cellar and storage facility on that property. On the morning of Friday, December 2nd, 2022, 24 hours after Elara walked into the Morton Public Library, Detective Meyerson appeared before a Lewis County Circuit Court judge with a 46-page affidavit in support of a search warrant for 4.8 acres of forested property at 1174 Clearwater Ridge Road, Morton, Washington, registered to Martin Allen Colby. The affidavit included the full investigative history, the tree markings, the geographic correlations, the anonymous phone call, the prepaid phone tower data, and Elara Voss's testimony. The judge, a deliberate woman named Honorable Sylvia Price, 62, read the affidavit in its entirety before signing the warrant. The signing was at 9:47 a.m. The tactical team arrived at Clearwater Ridge Road at 11:15 a.m. The property was approached from the access road. The drive was gravel, 200 meters long, banked on both sides by mature second-growth fir. At the end of the drive sat a house, one-story, tan vinyl siding, green metal roof, a covered porch with 2 plastic chairs, and a hanging plant in a terracotta pot that had recently been watered. A wind chime made of aluminum tubes turning slowly in the morning air. A welcome mat with a pattern of autumn leaves. A small wooden birdhouse on a post near the path to the front door, its opening precisely oriented to face south, as recommended by wildlife guides for maximum occupancy. The front porch held a pair of mud-caked work boots, placed side by side with exactitude. The tactical team, 8 officers led by Lewis County SWAT Commander Lieutenant Doug Prentice, 50, established a perimeter, while Meyerson and Brad Toes approached the front door. They knocked at 11:19 a.m. Martin Colby answered within 40 seconds. He was wearing canvas work pants, a flannel shirt, a green fleece vest. His brown hair was grayer at the sides than in the volunteer search photo from 2019. He looked at the badge Detective Meyerson held and said very calmly, "All right." He was handcuffed on the porch at 11:21 a.m., while still warm from whatever he had been doing inside the house. He said nothing. He watched the tactical team move past him into his house, with the expression of a man watching a process he had perhaps, at some level, long been waiting for, a waiting so deeply internalized that its conclusion had lost the capacity to produce emotion. He looked, an officer standing beside him during the entry later noted, like someone who'd been holding their breath for a really long time and was just now letting it go. The interior of the house was impeccable. Dishes drying on the rack beside the kitchen sink, precisely stacked. A vacuum track pattern still visible on the living room carpet. On the mantelpiece, 3 framed photographs. An older couple, probably parents, at a picnic table. A dog, large and black, that appeared to be deceased given the vaguely memorial framing. A forest scene, taken from a high vantage point. The tree canopy spreading below like a green sea. On the coffee table, a library book. Lewis County Library stamp inside the cover. On the subject of wilderness navigation, a bookmark placed approximately 2/3 through. The kitchen smelled of coffee and dish soap. The coffee was still warm in the pot. Behind the kitchen was a mudroom, standard in construction for the region, coats on hooks, a second pair of work boots, a row of shelves holding work gloves, a first aid kit, insect repellent, spare batteries. On the lowest shelf behind a folded emergency poncho, a small canvas pouch. Inside the pouch, a chisel, approximately 12 centimeters long, with a blade width of exactly 5 centimeters. The blade was clean, but under ultraviolet examination, it would later show traces of sap from Douglas fir, consistent with the cambium layer of the trees where the markings had been found. The cellar was accessed through a door in the mudroom floor. The door was not hidden. It was not concealed behind the refrigerator or under a rug or behind false shelving. It was a steel-framed hatch with a single padlock, set flush into the mudroom floor, the kind of door that would have been unremarkable in any rural Pacific Northwest home, built before 1970. Lewis County Deputy Patricia Shores, 42, cut the padlock with bolt cutters at 11:38 a.m. She pulled the hatch open, and a smell emerged. Cold concrete, dampness, the faint metallic quality of enclosed air breathed and rebreathed over a long period. A trace of something that might have been a cleaning product, and underneath it, something organic that defied easy categorization. The stairs descended 12 steps. At the bottom, a single bare bulb on a wall socket, not currently illuminated. Flashlight beams swept the space. The room was 5 meters by 4 meters, as Elara had described it. The walls were poured concrete, rough-surfaced, gray. The floor was concrete. There was a metal-framed cot against the south wall with a thin foam mattress, a single blanket folded with geometrical precision, and a pillow in a gray pillowcase. Against the east wall, a shelf unit holding a bucket with a sealed lid, a plastic water jug, a stack of paperback books of varying genres, detective fiction, natural history, a plant identification guide, 2 novels whose spines were cracked from repeated reading, a small stainless steel bowl, a plastic cup. On the north wall, running along the base, a horizontal pipe, copper, approximately 5 centimeters in diameter, attached to the wall with 2 metal brackets. It appeared to be part of an old heating or water system, no longer active. Behind the pipe, visible when Deputy Shores crouched to look, were scratch marks in the concrete. Small, careful, regular, row upon row of them, organized in groups of 7. The counting would take investigators 45 minutes. The total, confirmed by both Patricia Shores and a crime scene technician named Aaron Webb, 32, was 1,008, the same number Elara Voss had given Detective Meyerson at the hospital. On the wall beside the door, at a height of approximately 1.3 meters, elbow height for someone of Elara's build, there was a second series of marks, different from the calendar scratches. These were drawings, small, precise, made with the same gravel tool, covering an area roughly 40 centimeters square. Trees, rendered in minimal lines. Root systems, their spread and depth suggested with a few strokes. And within the trees, small symbols that the botanist Iris Nakamura called back to document the scene would later identify as representations of mycorrhizal networks, the underground fungal connections that Elara had been studying when she disappeared. Root to root to root, drawn in the dark over 3 years, a scientist maintaining the architecture of her thinking in the only medium available. The crime scene technician Aaron Webb photographed the drawings for 40 minutes. He was not someone who was moved easily by crime scenes. The job required a productive dissociation that he had cultivated carefully over 7 years of forensic work. He photographed the drawings, and then he stood back from the wall and looked at them. And later, in a conversation with a colleague, he said, "Someone kept their mind alive in there. That's what that was. That's what those drawings were." He did not say anything else about it. Martin Colby was transported to the Lewis County Detention Center at 12:14 p.m. He sat in the transport vehicle looking at the road ahead. He made no statement. He requested an attorney, which was his right, and he was provided one, a public defender named Marcus Yee, 47, no relation to the volunteer searcher, who would find his client's composure in the interview room more unsettling than any amount of aggression would have been. In the search of the property conducted over the subsequent 4 days, investigators found the following. In a locked metal cabinet in the mudroom, photographs of 5 different locations in Pacific Northwest wilderness areas, each photograph including a tree bearing the distinctive carved marking. In the same cabinet, a hand-drawn map of Gifford Pinchot National Forest with 11 locations marked by small red X's. In the detached garage, a collection of handmade tools, including 3 chisels in different sizes, all cleaned but retaining trace evidence of wood sap. Under the floorboards of the garage, accessed after a K9 unit indicated a secondary scent beneath the structure, a sealed plastic storage case containing personal items, a burnt orange fleece jacket, a forest green UW baseball cap, a pair of teal and black Salomon trail shoes, a field notebook with Elara Voss's handwriting on the first page and a mycorrhizal survey grid on the second, and a small laminated card with a handwritten checklist in neat, deliberate, slightly left-leaning script: map, compass, emergency whistle, fire starter, emergency blanket, water filter, first aid kit, headlamp with spare batteries, high-calorie food for 2 extra days. The woods don't care about your intentions. The chisel in the canvas pouch was matched by blade-width forensic comparison to the marks on the trees in all 6 previously documented locations across Washington state. The dates of those marks, estimated by forensic botany, bracketed the dates of 4 disappearances in those areas, including 2 cases that had been closed as accidental deaths in the years before the Voss case reopened the pattern. Those 2 cases were formally reclassified in January 2023. Martin Colby had been carving his mark into the trees for at least 9 years. The investigators never fully established what the mark meant. Colby did not explain it. Several theories were developed: a territorial marker, a way of documenting his locations, a form of record-keeping for crimes contemplated or committed, a symbolic notation whose meaning was entirely internal to his own cognition, and therefore permanently inaccessible. Ranger Vivian Dahl, who had first documented the marks in her Greenfield notebook in 2014, offered the most considered assessment in a statement she gave to the Lewis County District Attorney's investigator in February 2023. "I've thought about what those marks meant for 8 years, she said. "I've come to the conclusion that what matters isn't what they meant to him. What matters is what they mean to us now. They mean a person was here who understood this place as a place where his actions were invisible. He thought the forest would protect him. He was right for a long time. She paused. Then he wasn't. January 2023 to June 2024. The state of Washington charged Martin Allen Colby, 47, of Morton, Lewis County, with 1 count of kidnapping in the first degree, 1 count of unlawful imprisonment, 1 count of assault in the first degree, and, upon the reclassification of the 2 previously closed cases, 2 counts of murder in the second degree for the deaths of hikers whose remains, previously attributed to exposure and accidental causes, were found upon reinvestigation to bear evidence inconsistent with accidental death. The charges were filed on January 12, 2023. Colby was arraigned on January 16th and entered a plea of not guilty. He was held without bail. The trial began on March 4, 2024, in the Lewis County Superior Court before Judge Raymond Keene, 64, a gray-suited, methodical man whose courtroom was notable for its silence. He ran his proceedings with a stillness that made other courtrooms feel unnecessarily loud by comparison. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Nora Halstead, 52, a former federal assistant U.S. attorney who had returned to state practice with a focused intensity that her colleagues described admiringly as prosecutorial patience. Halstead's opening statement was 41 minutes long and contained 4,300 words. She did not raise her voice once. The physical evidence was presented over the first 2 weeks. The chisel and its botanical trace, matching all 6 marked trees. The personal belongings recovered from the garage storage case. The forensic anthropology reports on the 2 victims whose deaths were now reclassified. The construction and property records. The anonymous call audio and its cell tower provenance. The 1,008 scratch marks documented in the cellar. Aaron Webb, the crime scene technician, testified for 3 hours about the documentation of the scene, including the drawings on the north wall. He described them precisely and without editorializing. The jury looked at the photographs projected on the courtroom screen, the tiny root networks, the trees rendered in gravel scratches on a concrete wall, and the courtroom was very quiet. Detective Carol Meyerson testified for 7 hours over 2 days. She walked the jury through the 4-year investigative arc, the tree mark, the geographic correlations, the anonymous tip, the building permit withdrawal, and the convergence of evidence that had allowed her to construct the warrant affidavit. She was asked by Halstead to describe the moment she received the call from Lewis County Dispatch on December 1, 2022, informing her that Elara Voss had walked into the Morton Public Library. Meyerson paused for a moment, looked at the middle distance, and then said, "I sat in a parking lot for 3 minutes. I was trying to make it real." Her voice did not change. "Then I drove." Ranger Vivian Dahl testified about the tree marks and her documentation of them. She brought her green right in the Rainfield notebook. The prosecution introduced the notebook as Exhibit 34. It was passed among the jury. Several jurors looked at the 2014 pencil sketch, the rectangle, the 3 diagonal lines, drawn 9 years before the trial, for a long time before passing it to the next person. The defense strategy, developed by Marcus Yee and supplemented by 2 additional attorneys brought in for the capital case phase, rested on 3 arguments. First, that the forensic botanical evidence linking Colby's chisel to the tree marks was insufficiently precise to establish beyond reasonable doubt that Colby and not some other individual had made those marks. Second, that the 2 reclassified deaths had been investigated as accidental at the time, and the subsequent reclassification relied on contested interpretations of old physical evidence. And third, that Elara Voss's testimony, while compelling, was the account of a severely traumatized individual whose perceptions and memories had been compromised by 3 years of extreme psychological stress. The defense did not dispute that Elara Voss had been held in the cellar. It did not dispute that Martin Colby owned the property. It argued that the totality of the evidence had not proven, to the standard required, that Colby had put her there. Martin Colby testified in his own defense. He sat in the witness stand with his large, open face arranged in an expression of straightforward sincerity, and explained that he had purchased the property and had been aware of the cellar. The previous owner had used it for root vegetable storage, but that he had not constructed it, had seldom used it, and had no knowledge of how Elara Voss or her belongings came to be associated with it. When Nora Halstead cross-examined him, She asked him to explain the scratch marks on the cellar wall. He said he could not. She asked him about the calendar drawings and the root network drawings, and whose hands could have made them in that cellar. He said he did not know. She asked him about the storage case under the garage floor. He said he had not known it was there. He delivered each answer in the same calm, even tone. His face did not change. The jury retired on April 22, 2024. They deliberated for 6 days. On April 28, 2024, at 2:17 p.m., they returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Judge Keene sentenced Martin Allen Colby on June 14, 2024. The sentencing hearing lasted 3 hours. Colby received a term of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He stood for the sentence with his hands clasped in front of him and looked at the judge and said nothing. The person who spoke last at the sentencing hearing was Elara Voss. Her victim impact statement was 11 pages long, typed, and she read it in full, standing at the microphone in a blue blazer, her voice steady and carrying. She did not describe what had been done to her in the terms the court documents had used, the clinical terminology of assault and restraint and deprivation. She described what she had thought about in the cellar. She described the drawings on the wall. She said she had drawn the mycorrhizal networks because she needed to keep thinking about the things she had been studying before she was taken, the way trees communicate through root systems, the way information moves through living networks below the visible surface, the way an individual tree that appears isolated is, in fact, connected to everything around it through a system invisible to the naked eye. She said that in the cellar, in the dark, drawing those networks with a piece of gravel on concrete, she had kept reminding herself that connection exists even when it is not visible, that she was connected even when she could not see or feel the connections, that the people who had not stopped looking for her were, in some sense, she could not have articulated at the time, but could articulate now, the underground network she had been drawing on that wall. I knew Josie still had the list, she said, the hiking checklist. I knew she wouldn't throw it away. She paused. I don't know how I knew that. I just knew. She looked down at her pages and then back up at the courtroom, and I was right. The courtroom was quiet for a moment after she finished and sat down. Then it was not quiet, because Judge Keene had adjourned the session and the room began to fill with the sound of people in motion, the ordinary sound of a proceeding ending, and Diane and Gerald Voss were beside their daughter. And that is where this record appropriately ends, not with the man in handcuffs, not with the door of the prison receiving him, but with that small cluster of 3 people in a courtroom in Lewis County, Washington, standing together in the sound of the world continuing. Carol Meyerson retired from the Skamania County Sheriff's Office in December 2024, after 20 years. Her colleagues gave her a party in the conference room, where the map with the pushpins had hung for 4 years. Someone had framed a photograph of that map, the red pins for tree marks, the yellow for disappearances, the single yellow pin for Morton, and given it to her. She kept it in her home office, not on the wall, but face down on a shelf, and she said, when asked why, that she knew what it showed, and she didn't need to see it to remember it. Vivian Dahl was promoted to District Ranger for the Cowlitz Valley Ranger District in 2023. In her first month in the new role, she instituted a systematic photographic documentation protocol for any unidentified or non-standard marks found on trees within the district's managed areas, and shared the protocol with 6 adjacent districts. The protocol is now used across the entire Gifford Pinchot National Forest management structure. It does not have an official name. Rangers in the field call it, informally, the Dahl Log. Ed Griggs, the camp host at Iron Creek Campground, retired from the position in October 2023. Before he left, he planted a small red cedar sapling at the edge of campsite number 8, the one Elara had always preferred. He did not file any paperwork about it. He just planted it, pressed the soil around the base with both hands, and went back to his trailer. Paul Yee, the volunteer searcher who found the marked tree in September 2019, learned of the resolution of the case from a news article shared on social media in December 2022. He had thought about the tree mark periodically in the intervening years, the way a person thinks about something they encountered once and did not fully understand. When he read that the mark had been central to the eventual investigation, he sat with that for a while. He later said that the experience had changed the way he moved through landscapes, that he had become, in some oblique and unplanned way, more observant. I look at trees differently now, he said. I look at everything a little more carefully. He paused. That seems like the least I could do. Elara Voss defended her doctoral thesis in May 2025 at the University of Washington. The thesis was titled Continuity and Recovery in Mycorrhizal Networks Following Mechanical Disruption, a field study in Pacific Northwest old-growth ecosystems. The abstract noted that the fieldwork had been conducted between 2018 and 2024, following a period of interrupted research. Dr. Renata Cho was present for the defense. The committee passed the thesis unanimously, with distinction. On the day of the defense, Elara drove south on I-5 and then east on Highway 12 and turned off the highway at the sign for Gifford Pinchot National Forest and drove the gravel road to Iron Creek Campground. She parked in the lot. She walked to the trailhead, where the register still hung in its weatherproof box. She opened it and looked at the pages. New pages. A new book. The old register long since archived as evidence. She took out a pen. She wrote her name, the date, the time, and her planned return time, 3 hours. In the notation field, she wrote Iron Creek East Fork, Mycorrhizal Grid Survey Continuation. She signed the register and walked into the forest. At 2.3 kilometers in, where Paul Yee had found the marked tree in September 2019, the Douglas fir still stood. The carved mark had weathered over 5 years. The edges softened by the tree's own slow growth, the cambium darkened and partially healed over, the 3 parallel lines less distinct than they had been in Paul Yee's original photograph. In another decade, the tree would have grown over the wound entirely. The wood would close around it the way living systems close around damage, incorporating the injury into the tissue, carrying it forward. Elara stood at the tree for a moment. She put her palm against the bark. The Douglas fir was approximately 200 years old. She knew this from its circumference and the typical growth rate for the species at this elevation, and had survived storms and insects and fire and drought, and the slow perturbation of a changing climate, and whatever human hands had done to it over 2 centuries, and was still here, its roots reaching through the soil in every direction, connected below ground to everything around it. She stood there for a while, her hand against the bark. Then she took out her field notebook, clicked her pen, and began to work.
What is the real takeaway from this story? First, she wasn't found thanks to technology or a helicopter. She was found by herself and a chain of people who did their jobs just a little more attentively than was required. A ranger who spent 8 years photographing strange markings just in case. A dispatcher who broke the waiting protocol because she had a gut feeling. A volunteer with no experience who simply noticed that a notch looked intentional. Second, the criminal wasn't hiding in the woods. He was hiding in the gap between districts, agencies, and databases. The forest was just a backdrop. And third, she returned to the same tree and continued her work. That is perhaps the most powerful part of the whole story. Share this video and write in the comments which moment hooked you the most. I'm genuinely interested to read them.